Get out, excellent King's Guard, enforces the rules long guard today. The marble halls gleamed under the soft glow of chandeliers, and the air was thick with the sound of servants scurrying about, setting tables, arranging flowers, and polishing the gleaming silverware. Outside, the evening sun was beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow over the castle grounds. It was a moment of perfection, a moment meant to celebrate the crown, the kingdom, and the king himself. But in the shadows of this elegance, a quiet and important figure was preparing for something much more serious. Commander Roland of the King's Guard stood silently at his post, his sharp eyes scanning the courtyard. He was a man of few words, but those who had seen him in action knew that his silence was a sign of his unwavering focus. As the leader of the elite guard, Roland's duty was not only to protect the royal family, but also to enforce the rules that kept the palace and its inhabitants safe. The King's Guard wasn't just a group of soldiers. It was a symbol of authority and security. For Roland, this role was more than just a job. It was a way of life. Roland had been in the king's service for many years, and over time he had built a reputation that few dared challenge. He was known for his strict adherence to the rules, his absolute loyalty to the king, and his remarkable ability to remain calm even in the most dangerous situations. He was the kind of man who saw things in black and white. Rules were meant to be followed, and those who tried to break them were not to be trusted. His men respected him, but they also feared his stern discipline. If you made a mistake under Roland's watch, it would not be forgotten easily. On this particular evening, however, things were not going as smoothly as they should have. While the palace was bustling with guests arriving for the royal ball, there was one man who had managed to slip past security without anyone noticing. No one was sure how he had done it. He didn't seem to fit the usual profile of a guest or dignitary. His clothing was of fine quality, but it wasn't quite right for the occasion. His face, though handsome, held an air of mystery, and his eyes betrayed a sense of purpose that made the guards uneasy. The man had slipped into the grand hall unnoticed, mingling among the guests and exchanging pleasantries with nobles, as if he belonged. His behavior was confident, but there was something about him that unsettled Roland. It wasn't just his presence that was troubling, it was the way he acted. He didn't seem to care about the formalities that came with being in the presence of royalty. He was too casual, too relaxed for someone in a place where rules were sacred. When Roland received the news that an unknown man had breached the palace security, his first instinct was to remain calm and assess the situation. There was no immediate threat, but that didn't mean the situation wasn't serious. Someone had bypassed the palace's strict security measures, and that was not something to be taken lightly. Roland's mind immediately went into tactical mode. How could this man have gotten inside without anyone noticing? What was his purpose? He made his way through the palace corridors with quiet determination, his footsteps echoing softly in the marble halls. As he approached the grand hall, he could hear the soft murmur of voices and the laughter of guests. He stood at the door for a moment, listening. Roland's sharp eyes scanned the crowd, quickly narrowing in on the man who had been causing the disturbance. He was standing near the king's table, smiling and talking with a group of noblemen. To any casual observer, the man looked like just another guest. But to Roland, his presence was a glaring problem. The commander stepped into the room, his tall, imposing figure immediately commanding attention. The chatter died down as he approached, and all eyes were on him. Roland didn't speak immediately. He didn't need to. His very presence was enough to silence the room. He walked towards the man with deliberate steps, every movement calculated. There was no room for mistakes when you were in charge of protecting the kingdom's most important figures. When Roland reached the man, he stopped. The intruder turned to face him, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ah, the King's Guard," the man said smoothly, his voice calm and controlled. I've heard much about you. Roland didn't return the smile. You're not invited, he said coldly. His voice was firm like iron, unyielding and resolute. I need you to leave. The man's expression didn't falter. But I have a message for the king. It's very important, he said, his eyes glinting with a strange intensity. I have information that could change everything. Roland's brow furrowed, but he didn't flinch. You don't have an invitation, and that's enough of a reason to escort you out. Now move. The man's smile widened, but there was no humor in it. You think you can just remove me? You think you understand the situation, he said, his voice growing a bit louder, catching the attention of those nearby. There are things happening in this kingdom that you don't even know about. The king is in danger and you're all blind to it. Roland's eyes narrowed. His patience was running thin, but he held himself in check. I'm not interested in your games, he said. If you don't leave now, I'll have you removed by force. The man raised an eyebrow but didn't make any sudden moves. For a brief moment, Roland thought the intruder might back down, but instead the man stood there staring at him with an unsettling calmness. It was as if he was daring Roland to act. Very well, Roland said, his voice now low and menacing. You've been warned. Without another word, Roland stepped forward, grabbing the man by the arm and beginning to guide him toward the exit. But the man didn't resist, not at first. As they neared the door, however, the intruder suddenly stopped, pulling away with surprising strength. He turned and locked eyes with Roland, his expression now dark and serious. You have no idea what you're dealing with, he said, his voice low but intense. You may think you're protecting the king, but you're just a pawn in a much larger game. Be careful, Commander. There are forces at work here that even the king's guard can't protect against. Roland's grip tightened, his heart racing for a moment, but he didn't let the man's words shake him. With a final push, he escorted the intruder outside, his mind already racing with thoughts of what had just happened. The evening had only just begun, but Roland knew that this was no ordinary night. The calm, perfect surface of the palace was hiding something much darker, and Roland was determined to get to the bottom of it. The moment Commander Roland escorted the mysterious man out of the grand hall, the entire atmosphere of the royal palace seemed to shift. The guests who had been enjoying the evening's festivities now whispered among themselves, their curiosity piqued by the strange encounter. The man's words, which had carried an unsettling weight, still echoed in Roland's mind. You have no idea what you're dealing with, forces at work here that even the king's guard can't protect against. Roland couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter had been more than just an intrusion. There had been a strange intensity in the man's voice, something that suggested he wasn't simply an uninvited guest with a few wild ideas. His calm demeanor had masked a deeper threat, one Roland couldn't quite understand yet. But there was no time for uncertainty. The commander had a duty to fulfill, and the king's safety was his primary concern. Roland had made his decision to remove the man, but a nagging sense of unease lingered. He could only hope that his actions had been the right ones. As Roland walked the man to the gates of the palace, he tried to gauge the intruder's intentions. The man had hardly put up a fight when Roland took hold of his arm and guided him toward the exit, but there was something almost too easy about it. Roland couldn't help but feel as though he was being led into something much larger than he had anticipated. The man's name, as he had introduced himself, was Marcus, though Roland had his doubts that it was his true name. He didn't seem like a common troublemaker, and his elegant clothing suggested that he was someone of importance. Yet, his behavior didn't match that of a nobleman or even a dignitary. There was an air of secrecy about him, like he was hiding something, something he wasn't ready to reveal. Once they reached the gates, Roland gave the man a final warning. Leave the palace grounds immediately. Do not come back. Marcus turned to face him, his calm expression unchanged. You don't understand, Commander, he said, his voice low and serious. You are only seeing the surface. There's a bigger picture, one that you're not privy to. Roland stood firm, his gaze hardening. If you come back, I will not hesitate to take further action. I suggest you don't test me. Marcus raised his hands in mock surrender. Very well, but remember my words, Commander. They will come back to haunt you. I'm not the only one who sees the cracks in the palace walls. With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. As Roland stood at the gates, his thoughts were a whirlwind. What had the man meant by cracks in the palace walls? Was there something more going on beneath the surface that he didn't know about? Roland had always prided himself on being able to see through deception, but Marcus's calm words had shaken him more than he cared to admit. He stood there for a moment, taking in the quiet of the palace grounds. The grand ball was still going on inside, the laughter and music continuing as if nothing had happened. But for Roland, everything had changed. He knew that he couldn't simply let this strange encounter slip away. Something was wrong. He could feel it deep in his gut. Roland's instincts told him to trust no one. He had learned that lesson the hard way. The royal palace was full of political intrigue, power struggles, and whispers in the dark. He had seen it all during his years of service, and he knew better than to let his guard down. But there was something about Marcus that made him question his usual methods. The man wasn't the type to show up uninvited without a reason, and Roland had no doubt that Marcus's appearance was no accident. Roland quickly made his way back inside the palace, his mind racing. He needed answers, but where could he find them? Inside, the ball was still in full swing. Nobles and dignitaries danced and mingled, their conversations light and carefree. It was as if the evening hadn't been interrupted by the intrusion of a man who had slipped past the best security in the kingdom. But Roland knew better than to take the situation lightly. He moved through the crowd, his sharp eyes scanning the faces of the guests. He didn't trust anyone in the room, not after what he had just witnessed. He couldn't help but wonder if there were others like Marcus, people who were hiding something, people who had their own agendas. He had to be careful. The stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. As Roland made his way through the hall, he spotted one of his fellow guards, Lieutenant Aidan, standing near the far wall. Aidan had been with the king's guard for just a few years, but he was already proving himself to be a reliable officer. Roland walked over to him, his footsteps steady and purposeful. "Aidan," Roland said in a low voice, "did anyone see anything unusual, any sign of trouble?" Aidan looked around cautiously before leaning in closer. "Nothing unusual, sir. Everything seems normal. But I did hear something earlier, a whisper maybe. Someone mentioned the name Marcus. It wasn't loud enough for me to catch everything, but it was enough to raise a flag. I thought it might be nothing, but—" Roland's interest was immediately piqued. "Marcus. What did they say about him?" Aidan shrugged. "I couldn't hear clearly, but the way they said it, it sounded like he was someone important, someone with connections. I don't know, sir, just something to keep in mind." Roland nodded, his mind racing. It seemed that Marcus wasn't as unknown as he had first appeared. There were whispers about him, even among the staff. That only confirmed Roland's suspicions. This man wasn't just an intruder, he was a part of something bigger. But what? As Roland turned to leave, Aidan stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. "Sir, if you don't mind me saying so, be careful. This isn't just a simple matter of security. There's something more to this. I can feel it too." Roland met Aidan's gaze, his expression hardening. "I know. I'm going to find out what it is." With that, Roland turned and walked away, his mind focused on the task ahead. He had no intention of letting this mystery slip away. Marcus's words had struck a chord, and Roland couldn't ignore them. If there were cracks in the palace walls, he would find them. And when he did, he would make sure that nothing, not even the most subtle threat, could undermine the safety of the kingdom or the king. Roland couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep within him after the encounter with Marcus. Every time he closed his eyes, the man's words echoed in his mind. growing louder and louder with each passing moment. You think you're protecting the king, but you're just a pawn in a much larger game. What did Marcus mean by that? Roland had spent years protecting the royal family, upholding the laws and enforcing the kingdom's rules. To have someone question his commitment was unsettling. The next day, Roland could hardly focus. The royal ball was over, but the tension it had caused lingered in the air. As the head of the king's guard, Roland was responsible for the safety and security of everyone within the palace walls, especially the king. But if there were forces at work within the kingdom that even he didn't understand, then how could he continue to protect the monarchy with certainty? The hours passed slowly as Roland moved through the palace, his thoughts a constant swirl of confusion and concern. His routine was disrupted. Normally, he would check in with his men and ensure that everything was in order. But today, his mind kept drifting back to Marcus, the man who had slipped through their most secure defenses and then walked away without a care in the world. Roland decided to visit the royal library. He had always found comfort in the quiet halls, surrounded by books that contained the wisdom of past kings and scholars. Perhaps he could find something, anything, that might shed light on Marcus's cryptic words. He knew that the king's enemies often lurked in the shadows, but he had never imagined that such an enemy might be so close to home. The library was as serene as ever. The scent of old leather-bound books filled the air, and the sound of the occasional turning page was the only noise to be heard. Roland walked along the aisles, his hand grazing the spines of books as he passed. His mind was still racing, but the calmness of the room helped to steady his thoughts. He stopped in front of a large, ancient tome. It was a book that had been passed down through generations of the royal family, containing records of past rulers and important events in the kingdom's history. Roland opened the book, hoping to find something useful, but as he scanned the pages, nothing seemed to stand out. Frustrated, Roland turned to leave, but as he made his way toward the door, he overheard a conversation between two palace servants. They were standing in the corner, talking in hushed voices, but Roland's keen ears caught the words. "Did you hear? The king is meeting with someone important today, someone who could change everything," one of them whispered. "Who?" the other asked. "Is it someone we should be worried about?" "I don't know," the first servant replied, "but I heard his name, Marcus. The one who showed up at the ball last night." Roland froze. The name sent a chill through him. Marcus, the man he had escorted out of the palace, was now somehow involved with the king. Roland's mind raced as he pieced the fragments of the conversation together. Marcus had been bold enough to appear at the royal ball uninvited, and now he was meeting with the king. Roland couldn't allow this to happen without understanding the full picture. He approached the servants, who quickly fell silent as he neared. Roland's stern gaze fixed on them, and without a word, they both lowered their eyes in respect. He didn't need to say anything. They knew the gravity of the situation. "Where is the king?" Roland asked in a low voice. The servants exchanged nervous glances before one of them spoke up. "He's in the private chambers, sir. With Marcus, we believe. It's a secret meeting, not even the courtiers know about it." Roland nodded, his face hardening. "Thank you," he said, before turning sharply and heading toward the king's private chambers. His pace quickened as he moved through the corridors of the palace. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of his duty pressing on him. He had to find out what was happening. If the king was meeting with Marcus in secret, there was no telling what kind of influence the man had already gained. Roland had to protect the king, no matter the cost. As he reached the door to the private chambers, Roland hesitated. He had never before felt the need to question the king's judgment, but this situation was different. The man he had escorted out of the palace just hours earlier was now in the king's presence, and Roland wasn't sure if he could trust the king's decision. He stood outside the door for a moment, listening carefully. There was a low murmur of voices from within, but he couldn't make out the words. Roland pressed his ear against the wood of the door, trying to hear more clearly. His heart was pounding in his chest, his thoughts racing with every possible scenario. Suddenly, the door creaked open. Roland stepped back just in time to avoid being noticed, but he could see the king's silhouette through the narrow gap. The king was sitting at a large table with Marcus standing opposite him. They were deep in conversation, but Roland could only hear snippets of their exchange. "The kingdom is fragile, your majesty. There are forces working against you, against all of us." Marcus's voice was low but clear. "You need to make a choice, and you need to make it soon." Roland's grip tightened on the hilt of his sword as he listened. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Was Marcus threatening the king, or was he trying to manipulate him? Roland didn't know, but he couldn't stand idly by any longer. He had to act. Before he could make up his mind, the door opened wider and Marcus stepped out into the hallway. Roland immediately stepped into the shadows, making sure he wasn't seen. His heart raced as Marcus walked past him, his expression unreadable. Roland could feel the tension in the air, and for the first time in a long while, he was uncertain about what lay ahead. As Marcus disappeared around the corner, Roland stepped forward, determined to confront the king. He entered the private chambers, his eyes locking with the king's. The king was sitting at the table, his expression calm but weary. "Your Majesty," Roland began, his voice steady but filled with urgency, "I must ask, what is going on? Who is Marcus and what is he doing here?" The king looked at him for a long moment as if weighing his words. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "I trust him, Commander. He's not an enemy. In fact, he may be the only person who can help us now." Roland's mind was reeling. The king trusted Marcus. What had the man said to convince him of that? Roland didn't know if he could accept the king's judgment, but one thing was clear. He would have to dig deeper if he was going to protect the kingdom from whatever was unfolding in the shadows. The news that the king trusted Marcus hit Roland harder than he expected. As he stood in the private chambers, staring at the king, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of confusion and concern. He had always believed in the king's wisdom, in the strength of his leadership. The king had always made decisions with the kingdom's best interest at heart. But now, Roland was left questioning everything. The king's calm demeanor gave little away, but Roland knew there was more to this meeting with Marcus than he had been told. The man's earlier words still lingered in Roland's mind. "There are forces working against you, against all of us." What did Marcus mean by that? And why was the king so willing to trust him? "Your Majesty," Roland said, his voice steady but laced with concern. "With all due respect, I must ask again, what exactly is happening? Who is Marcus and why are you trusting him? I've seen firsthand the way he manipulates situations. He is no common man." The king looked at Roland with tired eyes, his gaze heavy but kind. "I understand your concerns, Commander. I know this is difficult to accept, but Marcus is not an enemy. He comes from a place that has long been hidden from us, an area beyond our borders, a place where power struggles are not what they seem." Roland frowned, trying to digest what the king was saying. "A place beyond our borders? You mean another kingdom?" he asked, his mind racing. "And why is he here in our palace speaking of power struggles?" The king leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him, deep in thought. "Marcus comes from a land where the rules we live by are not the same. In his world, alliances are made not just through diplomacy but through power, influence, and secrecy. His people know things we don't, and they've been watching us for years. He believes there are dark forces within our own kingdom, forces that threaten us all." Roland's heart sank. "Dark forces? What do you mean? Are you saying there are traitors in the palace?" "In our own guard." The king didn't answer immediately, instead staring at Roland with an almost sorrowful expression. "It's more complicated than that. Marcus believes that there are people within the kingdom who are working against me, against the throne." He says they've infiltrated the palace in ways we cannot see. I trust him because he's been right before. Roland's mind raced as the king's words settled in. The idea of traitors within the palace was terrifying, but it wasn't completely out of the realm of possibility. Roland had always kept a sharp eye on his men, but could he have missed something? Could there be someone among the king's guard who had betrayed their oath? But why wouldn't you tell me this sooner? Roland asked, the weight of his doubts pressing on him. Why did you keep it from me, your majesty? The king sighed deeply. I didn't want to alarm you. I've had my suspicions for a while, but I needed time to understand who Marcus was and what he truly wanted. He has information, Commander, information that could change everything. But he's also asking for something in return, and that's what concerns me. Roland's chest tightened. He had always believed that loyalty to the king was absolute, but now he was hearing that Marcus, a man whom Roland had just met, was asking for something in return. What could that possibly be, and why was the king willing to consider such an arrangement? What does he want? Roland asked, his voice low and filled with an urgency he couldn't hide. The king hesitated, as if reluctant to share the full extent of what Marcus had proposed. Marcus believes that if he helps us uncover the traitors in the palace, he will need something in return. A position of power, an alliance with the crown, perhaps. I'm still not entirely sure. But the thing is, I can't afford to ignore what he's offering. Roland's thoughts were spinning. You're saying that Marcus wants to make a deal. He's using the kingdom's safety as leverage. The king nodded slowly. In a way, yes, but there's more to it. Marcus has resources that we don't. He has eyes and ears in places we've never thought to look. If we can trust him, we might be able to root out these forces before they strike. Roland clenched his fists, trying to contain the growing frustration within him. It was one thing to protect the kingdom. It was another to rely on an outsider with his own agenda. Roland had always fought for what was right, never once considering a path that involved compromise. But now, it seemed that compromise was the only way forward. I don't trust him, your majesty, Roland said, his voice firm, but there was a note of uncertainty in it as well. I've seen the way he works. He's a man of hidden motives, and I fear that his help might come at too high a price. The king leaned forward, his eyes meeting Roland's. I understand your hesitation, but I'm running out of options. If there is a conspiracy within the kingdom, we need to act quickly. We cannot afford to wait. And Marcus is the only one who seems to know the true nature of what's happening. Roland's thoughts swirled in a storm of confusion and suspicion. He wanted to believe in the king's wisdom, but he couldn't ignore the feeling in his gut that something was deeply wrong. The more the king spoke, the more Roland felt that they were playing into Marcus's hands, like pawns in a game that they didn't fully understand. What happens if we refuse him? Roland asked, his voice quiet but filled with determination. The king's expression hardened. Then we risk everything. Marcus has already shown us what he knows. If we turn him away, we may be blindsided when the real threat strikes. I don't want to gamble with the kingdom's future, Commander. Roland stood in silence for a moment, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. He had always been a man of action, someone who trusted his instincts and did what was necessary to protect the king and the kingdom. But now, faced with a choice between loyalty and the unknown, he felt as though he were standing on the edge of a precipice, unsure of which direction to take. I will do whatever it takes to protect you, your majesty, Roland finally said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. But I must warn you, if Marcus is playing us, we will not be able to turn back. The king nodded gravely. I know the risks, Roland. But I believe we have no other choice. Roland left the king's chambers, his thoughts still racing. The kingdom's safety hung in the balance, and he knew that the next steps would determine not only the fate of the monarchy but also his own future. If Marcus was telling the truth, they could save the kingdom from the forces that threatened it. But if he was lying, Everything Roland had worked for could crumble. The decision had been made. Roland's mind was still a whirlpool of thoughts and emotions, but he knew one thing for certain. The kingdom's future hung in the balance, and there was no turning back now. The king had placed his trust in Marcus, and whether Roland liked it or not, he was now bound to follow the king's decision. His duty, after all, was to protect the crown, even if the path forward seemed shrouded in uncertainty. Roland spent the next few days carefully watching Marcus. He had tried to get close to the man, but Marcus always seemed to be one step ahead. He was elusive, popping in and out of the palace, meeting with unknown figures and making cryptic statements that only deepened Roland's suspicions. Every time Roland thought he had a grasp on what was happening, it felt like the pieces slipped away, leaving him with more questions than answers. But the longer Roland observed Marcus, the more he noticed something strange. There was a certain tension in the air whenever Marcus was around. It wasn't just the subtle undercurrent of danger that Roland had expected, it was something deeper, something that felt almost personal. Roland couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus was playing a game, and he wasn't sure if he was a player or a pawn. The day arrived when Marcus finally made his move. Roland had been called to the royal chambers, where the king had requested his presence. As he walked through the halls, the air felt thick with anticipation. He couldn't help but wonder if today would be the day when everything came to light. When he entered the king's chambers, he found not only the king but also Marcus, standing by the window, his back to the door. The tension in the room was palpable. "Commander Roland," the king said, his voice calm but heavy with purpose. "I've called you here because Marcus has brought news that could change the course of this kingdom. I trust you will listen." Roland nodded, his gaze fixed on Marcus. The man's back remained turned, but Roland could feel his eyes on him. He wasn't sure why, but the very sight of Marcus in the same room with the king made his stomach turn. It wasn't just the man's words that unsettled Roland. It was the way Marcus carried himself, as though he were more than just an outsider. It was as though he had already woven himself into the fabric of the kingdom, pulling strings that Roland could not see. "What is this news, Marcus?" Roland asked, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Marcus turned slowly, his eyes meeting Roland's with a quiet, almost knowing look. He didn't speak at once, as though savoring the moment. The silence stretched on, and Roland's impatience grew. What was so important? What had Marcus uncovered? Finally Marcus spoke, his voice smooth and calm. "There are traitors within these walls, Commander. People you know, people you trust." Roland's heart skipped a beat. His first instinct was to dismiss the words, but something about Marcus's delivery made him pause. Roland had always been taught to trust his instincts, but this was different. Could it be true? Could there really be traitors within the palace? "The king's guard?" Roland asked, his voice tight with disbelief. He had trained these men, fought beside them, trusted them with his life. "Are you saying that someone in my guard is working against us?" Marcus's gaze never wavered. "Not just in your guard. There are others, people who have been quietly undermining the crown for years. And now they're ready to strike." Roland's mind raced. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The very idea that someone within the palace, someone he had fought alongside, could be a traitor seemed impossible. But Marcus's words had a ring of truth to them that Roland couldn't ignore. He had seen the cracks in the kingdom's walls, the subtle signs of unrest, but this was something far more dangerous. "Who are they?" Roland asked, his voice low but filled with urgency. "Tell me who they are." Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the desk in the center of the room and placed a sealed letter on it. "I've compiled a list," he said, his tone cool and matter-of-fact. "The names of those who have been conspiring against the throne, people who have sold their loyalty for power, for wealth, for influence. It's all in that letter." Roland's eyes narrowed as he stepped forward, his hand reaching for the letter. He didn't hesitate. He had to know. He had to see for himself who had been betraying the king. But as he reached for the letter, he hesitated for a brief moment, glancing at the king. The king gave a small nod, his face grim but resolute. "Take the letter, Roland. We need to act quickly. These traitors will not wait much longer." Roland's hand closed around the letter, and he tore the seal open with a sharp motion. The contents inside were chilling. Names, dates, meetings. Every detail was meticulously outlined, painting a picture of a conspiracy that had been years in the making. Roland scanned the names, his heart sinking as he read each one. There were people he knew, people he had trusted. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Roland's voice faltered for a moment, but he regained his composure. "This is impossible. Are you sure this is true?" Marcus stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "I'm sure. Everything I've told you is the truth, Commander. It's up to you now to decide what happens next." Roland stood in silence, the weight of the letter in his hands almost too much to bear. The king's voice broke through his thoughts. "We need to act, Roland. We cannot afford to wait. These traitors must be dealt with swiftly." Roland nodded, his mind still reeling. The decision had never been so clear or so difficult. He had always believed in the honor of the king's guard, in the loyalty of those he had served alongside. But now, that loyalty was in question. How could he face those he had once trusted, knowing that some of them had betrayed the kingdom? The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a mountain. He had to protect the king. He had to protect the kingdom. But at what cost? Would he be able to carry out the task Marcus had given him, knowing the consequences for those involved? Roland turned to the king, his expression hardening. "I will do what must be done, Your Majesty, but I need your assurance that this conspiracy is real. That we are not being played." The king met his gaze with a steady, unwavering look. "I trust Marcus, Roland. His information is accurate, and I trust you to carry out what needs to be done." Roland's heart clenched. There was no turning back now. He had made his choice, and the kingdom's fate was now in his hands.